your music is such a gift to this congregation. Thank you. Last month, I took a media Sabbath. I stopped reading the news, and it did me a lot of good. One of the questions I had been asking myself was, how informed do I need to be? What level of current events literacy is enough? Because tanks aren't rolling down Willamette Street presently. And the truth is that most news doesn't affect my daily life. My uncle told me that as a 4-year-old child in Ukraine during World War II, he would pretend to be playing near where the adults would gather in the village square so he could overhear the gossip about when the actual tanks were coming. There's this real human impulse, even among kids, to want to gather as much information as we can about our own safety. And also, I think there's some level of obligation that we feel as people of morality to pay attention to atrocity and to not look away. But my question during my media Sabbath was, do I need to catch up on this every day? Or can I safely check in with the downfall of capitalism like once a week, like Friday afternoons, and see if it's all collapsed yet or not? How exposed to the news is exposed enough? And so it was having ended this restful period of media Sabbath that a couple days ago, I was looking again at a popular news website, and I was just struck, or maybe a better word would be stricken, by seeing 2 different articles on the front page. The first, titled, "Students Sent Heartbreaking Texts During the Florida School Shooting." I shouldn't have clicked. I knew I shouldn't have clicked. You can imagine what it contained. Screenshots of conversations with their parents. Parents urging their children to stay quiet. Stay hidden, please. Helpless to protect them. And the other article, titled, "35 Easy and Fun Ways to Feel a Little Less Stressed." Yeah, and at that moment, I was just struck by the absurdity of being pitched these 2 articles side by side. I had so many questions. Why was I doing this to myself? Reading those text messages accomplished what exactly? What? Who did that help? Did it better inform me about something I need to know to go about my life as a decent human? Teaching me about new depths of horror? I got the message. From the bare facts of the shooting alone, that was enough. 17 dead. Children. Nothing more would be useful for me to read. But having pitched me raw human grief, having played to my fear and helplessness and sense of obligation, my need to keep reading, my need to be involved somehow, to my own detriment, the same website offered a solution. 35 easy and fun ways to feel a little less stressed. I could not think of many things less appropriate. I, for one, didn't feel like having fun at that particular moment, though it is a critical part of our life. Not at that moment. I wasn't thinking, you know what I need? I just need more fun. I just need a mani-pedi. That'll make this go away. How about you pitch me 35 fun and easy ways to disarm an overly weaponized country? As unnecessary and masochistic and voyeuristic as it felt to be obsessively consuming information about the shooting on that day, it would have felt flippant and clueless to try to fix it with a couple cocktails by the pool. I felt caught between my own need to do something and the uselessness of anything I could realistically do in an afternoon. And this is what I want to talk about. That we have entered a new era of political consciousness and social responsibility. The lessons of World War II are not that far from our memory. They're not lost upon us. Frightening as it is to see the rise of fascism and authoritarianism once again, we know what they are. We recognize them, and we know from history what it takes. Determined individuals acting cooperatively, acting swiftly and determinedly to oppose evil. we are aware of how vital it is that we each do something. But we're also raising kids. We're going to work, making dinner, folding laundry, feeding the cats, checking on our relatives, coping with heartbreaks. We're celebrating birthdays. We're having Pledging Sunday. We are living our normal lives simultaneously. Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough to carry on? Sensitive, civic-minded people, I think, often find it hard to accept that sometimes doing nothing in a given situation, that's an option. And that might be enough to go on living, to keep the lights on, as it were. It is, after all, a privilege to be able to look the other way, and it's one that we're uncomfortable doing. One modern critique of Unitarian Universalist social justice culture is how highly we praise activists for being willing to get themselves arrested. We praise them, we heap praise upon them for getting arrested in their congressman's office, tying themselves to a fence somewhere. But for racial minorities, transgender people, and the disabled, that badge of pride is utterly unacceptable. That is an irresponsible risk. Not everyone needs to go get themselves arrested. Sometimes just being is enough. That praise around such radical action indirectly shames people who only hold a sign, who only show up to church on Sundays, as if that was not enough to be in community with like-minded people, keeping the lights on. It shames people, the vast majority of people, who go quietly about living their good lives, as if that was not enough. And later, after seeing those two articles side by side, I happened to see a really timely Facebook post from my friend Alex Ruiz. He wrote, "Reminder that none of us is morally obligated to watch the shooting footage, absorb the info, and act accordingly. But triggering yourself won't help anyone." Because Alex is a writer, I later on asked him to elaborate, and I was not disappointed. He wrote back, "There's an impulse in a lot of us, especially those of us drawn to deep thinking and deep desires of empathy, to think that we can't care about suffering unless we expose ourselves to it. We can't care about suffering unless we expose ourselves to it. That impulse," he writes, "comes from somewhere well-intentioned, but it ignores the fact that we're human. We're also human with constitutions and fatigue and limited time and attention spans and, for that matter, capabilities. Part of living and helping is remembering that a destroyed person helps no one. Self-sacrifice is a beautiful story, but it should never be confused with self-mutilation." I have seen some brilliant, dedicated activists burn out because they couldn't set down the burden of being woke 24/7. And I have seen pictures of soldiers in World War II having tea in the trenches, stopping to have a cup of tea in the actual trenches. We use being in the trenches as a metaphor for doing the difficult work on the front lines of social justice work. And the people in the real thing knew to stop and have a cup of tea once in a while. That we can learn from. Can we do that? Wanting this world to have less suffering and knowing we must work for it does not require that I suffer more. There is not a zero-sum game of suffering in this world. And to be clear, a desire for a better world does require that we be vigilant about hypocrisy and not let ourselves off the hook and tell ourselves that the nothing we do is enough to fix things. What I'm saying is, what we do doesn't always have to be enough to fix things today. None of us needs to carry the world on our shoulders alone. It's a group effort. The choir can't all take a breath at the same time or the song would stop. But they do all need to take a breath sometime. And we're not all in the choir also. And I would argue that, in fact, it's a form of dangerous pride to think that we can and should be 100% on guard and responsible for the world's atrocities all the time, each of us individually. You're not Batman. I'm not Batman. There is no Batman. Feeling like what we do, our small part, is never good enough, it's also just not a good use of our time. I got the idea for this sermon some months ago from my friend Erin. And it's interesting how our friends often are the ones who have to point out that actually we're doing a pretty good job and better than we think we are. At the time, I was just fretting endlessly over a thesis draft, and she told me about the Good Enough song. I'm going to share it with you. She found herself writing an email, and it was taking way too long, just agonizing over every line. How is this person going to interpret it? How are they going to respond? And she came up with the song, and it goes like this. This is good enough. This is good enough. This is good enough. And then she clicked send. That's how the song ends. You click send, and then you're done. And it's not a great song. One might argue, though, it's good enough to do what it's supposed to. How many emails I've agonized over writing because I thought my response had to be impeccable, like what, there's a squad of people scrutinizing my emails and judging me. Should I care if there were? Only after having sent this impeccably Pulitzer Prize-worthy email, only to get a response back, often from a male colleague, that's like, oh yeah, well, sure, whatever. If only I had those hours back, what better things I could have spent them on. Endlessly stressing over how good of a job I should be doing is not only not a good use of my time, it's not a good use of anyone's time. It burns out entire activists' efforts when we argue over the font on the banner. Just get the banner up. Who's going to print the pamphlets? Who cares? Get the pamphlets out. I have personally found, and I've come back from seminary to tell you this, personally found misspellings in old Unitarian treatises from the 1800s, and let me tell you, it has not undermined my ministry. The perfect is the enemy of the good. That idea of ideological absolutism and purity is what universalism originally fought against. That Calvinist idea that only perfection is enough and nobody's enough, and you should all be ashamed. Then you go home from church and think about it, how terrible you are. It was our Universalist forefather, Hosea Ballou. He was once on a preaching circuit, and he stopped at this inn, and the innkeeper asked him, Mr. Ballou, how can you believe that sinners can get into heaven with unclean souls? And at the time, she was mopping by his table. And he said, Madame, do you require your floor to be clean before you mop it? Yes. At the time Universalism came to prominence in the US, there was in the Christian community a heavy emphasis on sin at that time. Like the societal brimstone quotient was at an all-time high. Everyone was a sinner, there was no way out, and the radical, heretical response of Universalism was, so? So what? So what? Aren't ordinary people enough? For hundreds of years, our faith has been arguing, yeah, you're enough. You're enough. The great universalist paradox is that we believe we're all enough, and yet we are always striving to do better and to be better. What we're not striving for is perfection. That's not the goal. I believe that all people are inherently good and worthy of love. And that faith emboldens me to say, I love every person in this room. Not because you brought snacks, or because you're on a committee, or because you pledge. Although I lift up the good works of those who do, and I thank you. But I've had multiple members of this church apologize to me in the short time that I've been here for not doing more, as if I would even know, and as if I would care. I couldn't care less about what you're doing or not doing. I love you unconditionally. It's not predicated upon your committee membership. I tell my students who are perfectionists, just turn in a bad paper, and they're astonished. They have never been given permission before to do an adequate job. So what? Turn in a bad paper. It's not going to go on your tombstone. They would rather turn in nothing or not show up than just do a bad job. And in a society where conscientious, caring people don't give themselves permission to do merely a good job or an adequate job, or to even just continue existing as they were, the result is that we have people sitting at home reading article after heartbreaking article because there's nothing else to do, and they know and believe in their heart that they're supposed to be doing something. What does it tell our visitors here at the church when we extend a radical welcome to all, but chastise ourselves for not doing more as individuals, as a church, or as a religion? That this is the place you come to where you're then responsible for the whole world? And I'm not saying that we should let ourselves off the hook and shirk all of our social responsibilities. That's not in our religious DNA. What I'm saying is that a radical welcome must be predicated on a theology of radical salvation and acceptance. Now come the stories in the news about what good people the victims of the shooting were, how promising their lives were, what good children, family members, and students they were. And I get it, it's a way of honoring what was lost, as if it could ever be encapsulated in those sound bites. And yet I ask myself, if they were flawed people, and they almost certainly were because we all are, would it matter? Would it make the loss any less? When a prominent member of a community gets deported nowadays, we hear he was a great father, a model employee, paid his taxes 30 years. Does it matter? Who cares? Or the dreamers, when we hear about them being deported, oh, it was so promising. What if they weren't promising? Don't they still deserve security, sanctuary, a home? Isn't that good enough that they were human? Every life lost, every person deported, every dream deferred is worthy and valuable. That is universalism. That they are good enough for us to care about, just as they are, unconditionally. And in the face of a radical regard for human life that we have, thoughts and prayers aren't good enough anymore. As a phrase, thoughts and prayers has come to epitomize political inaction, hypocrisy, and excuse-making. Thoughts and prayers has become a way of avoiding responsibility. And as someone who's literally in the business of praying, I am sick of hearing prayer used as an excuse. For me, prayer is meaningful, and there are times when thoughts and prayers are all we have to offer. But when you have the ability to draft legislation, don't offer me your prayer. That's not what I want from you. It cheapens prayer. Reverend Sidney writes in her letter to the church this week, "We are stunned by the corruption of politicians whose acceptance of gun lobby donations is at the expense of precious lives. Gun opponents twist reason into deflection and denial, arguing types of weapons while weaponizing prayer, blaming mental illness while removing restrictions in gun ownership and slashing mental health support, erasing the facts of Caucasian violence, militarizing daily life by defining protection as aggression instead of prevention." Many of our UU congregations have, as part of their covenant or their affirmations, this sentence, which you may have heard: "Love is our doctrine, the quest for truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer." Service is our prayer. In my faith, prayer is more than a soundbite or an excuse. It's used for others, not against them. And what does service in action look like? I recently heard someone say that young people today think that they're the first ones to be woke. She said she was so woke during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, she didn't even have to wake back up for the 2010s. Our actions are built upon a history of actions. This past decade, with the Great Recession, the Arab Spring, the global wave of refugees, and the new emerging civil rights struggle in the US, we sometimes forget that we are part of an unbroken tradition. From the civil rights activists of the 1960s, the suffragists of the early 1900s, the abolitionists of the 1860s, social justice, particularly in our faith, goes back centuries. It is an ongoing prayer with a never-ending amen. we are not reinventing what service or action is. Reverend Sidney writes, "So even, especially in the midst of these storm-tossed seas, like an ancient mariner, I have lashed myself to the mainmast of determination, resisting the siren calls on all sides. A terrorized culture is not normative. These lies do not go unchallenged. Nothing we do is in vain, as we keep our religious movement aflame and in solidarity with people of good faith. What does action look like when it's good enough? I would say to live a just life, to raise thoughtful, woke children, to align yourself with those who take actions that you might not be able to. Though I might not march, here I am with those who march. I might make coffee at the church of the people who march. I might not sew, but I am with those who sewed the Black Lives Matter banner stitch by stitch. Action is, above all, this, that I love my community, and I hold in love all those in this room and those around me. Throughout history, action has been made possible only in those places that have kept their doors open, that have survived and not folded. This church is kept alive by love and pledges, which are an act of love. I don't expect that this sermon alone will enact common sense gun legislation. I do know that the ongoing presence of a radical love in a radical community will. And for me, for today, that is enough. Amen. Ashe. Blessed be.